All right, ready for a deep dive that's going to stay with you.
I'm ready.
We're diving into a photo that shook the world. The image of Hector Peterson,
Oh, wow. Powerful image.
13 years old, killed during the Soweto Uprising in 1976.
Powerful symbol of the injustice of apartheid.
Exactly. But to really grasp its power, we need to rewind, understand the forces that led to that day.
Right, because it's more than just a photo. It's a culmination of so much.
Exactly. Now, some people might hear South Africa in the 70s and think, that feels like a world away. And geographically, sure.
A different world.
Yeah, but the echoes of this uprising, this one that started with something as basic as language in schools, they resonate even today.
Absolutely. The echoes are still felt.
To guide us through this complex emotional period, we have an expert in South African history with us.
Hello. Glad to be here.
So maybe let's set the stage first. Can you paint a picture for our listeners? What was life actually like for Black South Africans under apartheid in those years leading up to the uprising?
Imagine a system so deeply rooted in racial segregation that it dictated every single aspect of your life. Where you could live, work, who you could love, even marry. That was apartheid in South Africa.
Wow.
Black South Africans were treated as second-class citizens in their own land, denied basic human rights, relegated to the margins of society.
That's heavy stuff. So how did education play into all of this? It's hard to even imagine a system designed to, deliberately hold people back.
Education was very much a tool of oppression under apartheid. The Bantu Education Act of 1953, for example. It was specifically designed to limit opportunities for Black South Africans.
Wow.
Imagine this: chronically underfunded schools, overcrowded classrooms, lacking basic resources, and the curriculum itself geared towards preparing Black students for menial labor, not for higher education or professional careers.
It wasn't just about having separate schools, it was about creating two entirely different realities.
Exactly. One designed for success, the other for, as you said, subservience.
And that's where the issue of language becomes such a flashpoint.
Precise.
Okay, so help our listeners understand that. On the surface, a government decree about Afrikaners in schools, it might seem like a relatively small issue, like, okay, what's the big deal? But it wasn't just about the language, was it?
Not at all. Afrikaans was the language of the oppressors, the language of the very people who are enforcing this brutal system. Forcing Black students to learn in Afrikaans in schools already designed to hold them back. It was a calculated insult.
Wow.
A way of asserting dominance and control. It was a way of saying, we control your education, we control your future.
Control your identity, even.
Exactly. And that's where the Black consciousness movement comes in, led by the incredible Steve Biko.
Okay, yeah, I've heard that name.
He emerged in his late 60s, early 70s with this message of self-reliance and Black pride.
Powerful.
Because Biko, he recognized the psychological damage apartheid inflicted, how it aimed to make Black South Africans internalize this sense of inferiority. He urged them, reject that, embrace your heritage, fight for your rightful place.
So he wasn't just talking about dismantling a political system. He was talking about, a revolution of the mind.
Absolutely. Biko empowered a generation to see themselves as agents of change, not victims. His words, they resonated so deeply, especially with young people. But tragically, that message was cut short.
Oh, right, yeah.
1977, Biko died in police custody. Suspicious circumstances.
Understatement.
It was later revealed he'd been brutally beaten.
It's horrifying. His death had to have had a huge impact on the movement.
Oh, absolutely. He became a martyr, a symbol of the struggle. By this point, you have a generation radicalized by Biko's message, outraged by this Afrikaans decree, and then this, the death of their leader at the hands of the police. The stage was set for a confrontation.
And that brings us to June 16th, 1976.
A pivotal day.
Tens of thousands of students, many of them just kids, taking to the streets of Soweto, protesting the Afrikaans mandate, what was supposed to be a peaceful demonstration.
As so many are.
Becomes something far more tragic. Can you walk us through that day? What happened?
Thousands of students, many from Soweto's high schools, they organized this march to protest. They believed, as they had every right to, in their right to an education that empowered them, not limited their future. These students were met with a heavily armed police force.
It's hard to imagine.
The police responded, first with tear gas, and then with live ammunition.
It's unfathomable, that level of violence, especially against, unarmed kids.
It was a massacre. Hundreds injured, hundreds more, it is believed, killed. Among them was Hector Peterson.
That photo, I mean, it's seared into my memory, and I wasn't even alive to see it happen. To look at that image, the terror, the grief in his sister's face as she's running alongside him, it's impossible to not feel a profound sense of, like, anger, sadness.
It captures the horrors of apartheid in a way that words just can't.
Exactly.
And it's an image that shook the world.
And that's what's so fascinating about this whole event, is this is a textbook example of the butterfly effect. This seemingly localized event, a protest about language in schools, spirals outward, captures global attention. Like, how did that happen? How did the Soweto Uprising become this turning point in the fight against apartheid?
Images played a key role. The world watched in horror as the events unfolded on their TV screens.
Right.
That photo of Hector Peterson, the stories, those images, they transcended language barriers, ignited outrage, sympathy worldwide. But it wasn't just the images. It was the sheer scale of the violence and the fact that it was directed at children. It forced the world to confront the true brutality of apartheid.
And that outrage fueled a global response, right? Like, things start to change.
You had to. Governments that had turned a blind eye, they were forced to take a stand. The United Nations issued stronger resolutions.
Were there specific sanctions, or, like, were there actions that really put the pressure on?
The United States, for example, they had been hesitant to impose sanctions, afraid of harming economic interests. But they finally passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986.
What did that do?
This act imposed a range of economic sanctions on South Africa, including bans on investment, trade, and loans.
Okay, so hitting them where it hurts.
Other countries followed suit. The South African economy started to feel the squeeze.
So they're facing pressure on the world stage. But what about within South Africa itself? How did the government respond in the aftermath?
They clamped down even harder. They declared a state of emergency, giving police and military even broader powers, to arrest, detain, silence dissent. They tried to control the narrative, blame the violence on outside agitators, claim the students had posed a threat.
But the truth has a way of coming out.
It always does.
Yeah.
And inside South Africa, the spirit of resistance, far from being extinguished, was growing stronger.
Because they saw what happened?
They saw change as possible, that their voices could make a difference.
Wow. This was just the beginning, though, wasn't it? Even though it would be years before apartheid finally crumbled, this felt like the beginning of the end.
It was the earthquake that shook the very foundations of apartheid. It exposed its brutality to the world and set in motion the chain of events that would lead to its demise.
So much to unpack here. Let's talk about those ripples, those long-term consequences. We touched on the global response a bit, but what were the biggest, impacts of the uprising, both within South Africa and globally?
Well, the Soweto Uprising really changed the trajectory of the anti-apartheid movement, that's for sure.
Yeah.
On a global stage, it galvanized international condemnation of apartheid, led to increased sanctions, boycotts, divestment campaigns, you name it.
You mentioned the U.S. stepping up with sanctions. What about other countries? Was there a sense that South Africa was becoming like a pariah state?
Oh, absolutely. Many countries that had kept economic and diplomatic ties with South Africa, even if they, condemned apartheid in principle, they started to back away. They saw the writing on the wall.
Yeah.
The Soweto Uprising showed everyone how brutal that regime really was, made it impossible to keep up those relationships without their own citizens and, frankly, the whole world coming down on them.
So they're feeling the heat from all sides, and at the same time, the resistance inside South Africa is actually gaining momentum despite the crackdown. Seems like a real turning point.
It was. The uprising sparked a whole new ways of activism, especially among young people. Student organizations, labor unions, community groups, they mobilized across the country, organizing protests, strikes, acts of civil disobedience. They refused to be silenced, demanded justice.
And this all ties back to Nelson Mandela, right? I mean, he was in prison during the uprising, but the Soweto generation, as they're called, were so important in his release and the fall of apartheid.
Absolutely. Mandela might have been physically imprisoned on Robben Island, but his spirit was everywhere. The Soweto Uprising breathed new life into the movement for his release and the end of apartheid. It became a rallying cry, this symbol of the sacrifices made for the future they were all fighting for.
It's incredible how much changed between that uprising in '76 and Mandela's release in 1990.
It was a long, hard road, no doubt. Triumphs and tragedies along the way. But the Soweto generation and everyone who came after them, they never gave up hope. They understood that freedom isn't a gift, it's something you fight for. Their courage, their persistence when faced with such adversity, it's truly inspiring.
Absolutely. Their legacy still shapes South Africa today. I mean, even though apartheid is over, the stars of that system are deep.
That's right. Its legacy continues to cast a long shadow. The systemic inequalities from those decades of oppression, education, healthcare, housing, economic opportunity, they haven't disappeared. The fight for true social justice in South Africa is still going on.
It reminds us that getting rid of a system is one thing. Achieving true equality, that takes time, effort, a commitment from everyone to address those deep-seated injustices.
Exactly. And it reminds us that the fight for social justice never really ends. There will always be new challenges, new inequalities to face.
This deep dive into the Soweto Uprising has been heartbreaking, inspiring. We've looked at the horrors of apartheid, the bravery of those who resisted, and that long, long road to freedom.
It's a story that we need to keep telling, so we don't forget the sacrifices made and the lessons learned.
Well said. Thanks for taking us on this journey. I've learned so much today.
The honor was mine.
And to our listener, here's something to think about. What might seem like small acts of injustice are happening around us right now? What can we do in our own lives to make sure they don't turn into something much worse down the line? It's something I'll definitely be thinking about, and I hope you will too. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious.